This isn't really going to be a keynote as an opening talk. It's much more a chance to orient everybody to the purpose behind the seminar and what we're going to do today. I'll say a little bit about my own particular take on literacy as numbers, but it's also going to be this kind of scene-setting talk. So I think I'll stand up because then my voice will project better for you, and I'm out of the way, I hope, of this screen. There we go. Okay. Right, so this is what I'm going to talk about in my introduction. I'm going to just say a little bit about the origin of the seminar, how it came to be, and our interest in organising it. A little bit about the wider context of the topic, because it kind of pulls some boundaries out of a much bigger set of fields that we will be differently interested in around the room, I imagine. And I'm going to just say something about the themes that we set out for the day when we sent our original call for papers, and then talk about my interest, which is this idea of imagining what literacy is. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about that, and finish up by talking about what we might do, what our plans are, and what we might concoct today in the way of a continuing dialogue around these issues, because I know that there's people who would like that to happen. In terms of the origin of the seminar, I mean, it started, I would say, I'm not sure whether Brian would agree with this, but I think so, as these things often do, as a conversation in a coffee shop. We were on a panel at the American Applied Linguistics Association, and we were looking at, in the panel, comparing notes about some of the differences, the gaps between global policy and its effects on local practice. So comparing notes about some of the kind of implications and outcomes of surveys and the backroom workings of testing design, if you like, on literacy's work, and some of the consequences on from international practice. We were Jim Collins from the US, who was looking at bilingual education in the US, Judy Carlman, who was looking at some of the implications of policy in Mexico, which is a very different kind of context. Brian talking about his experience as being an ethnographer with the LAMP project in UNESCO, and me being interested in what was happening in the field of adult literacy in the UK. So we had different contexts, but they all converged, I think, around the issues to do with international surveys and the ways in which literacy was being increasingly conceptualised through number. We don't think we really planned it, but actually the timing of this seminar is actually very useful as well, because the latest of the big international OECD surveys, which people will probably be familiar with, the PIAC, which is the assessment, the new assessment of adult competences. Those results are coming out later this year. They're already beginning to trickle out. And we also have the UNESCO LAMP project, which is running on alongside. The PIAC, as people might know, builds on previous surveys, both the PISA project and the IELTS, the International Adult Literacy Survey. So there's a kind of convergence of the information and the expertise that's gone into these surveys, which is coming to fruition really around this time. So it seems a really good moment to be talking about literacy as number, what's been achieved through these kinds of initiatives. It's a mature field now, which can be reflected upon in terms of its achievements and perhaps some of the challenges that it's faced. So that, I would say, talks about the origins and why this is such a timely seminar. Why discuss literacy as numbers? Well, I don't think it's very controversial to say that large-scale enumerative projects around literacy are really an increasing feature of the global policy scene. And what's really important, I think, at the moment is that these surveys that really started very much from the rich Western countries that are involved with the OECD and the European Union as well, are still kind of orchestrating these surveys, but they're being expanded very significantly to other countries internationally, so that the context within which these surveys were originally designed is being extended more and more to contexts which you could call much more diverse. I mean, there's loads of diversity within the core OECD countries as well, but that diversity is being increased. The scope of these projects is trying to take in contexts for which they were not originally designed, and involves a lot of technical work to extend them. And that is within a context for those of us who have been involved in literacy studies over a number of years could say literacy itself is moving very rapidly. It's developing as populations migrate, and there are new mixtures of people, languages and literacies within the world which have to be taken account of by assessment practices. And also in terms of digital technologies, which are changing, I would argue, the nature of what literacy is and how it's being used and embedded in people's practices. So we've got big, important assessment regimes developing within a situation that underneath is extremely fluid and perhaps unpredictable. So I think that's one of the challenges for us today, is to hold both of those things in mind and have them within our discussion. As I said, the field of international testing is now pretty mature. That's not to say that it's solved all the problems that it faces, but it's definitely a moment where we need, I think those of us who organise this seminar would say, a productive critical debate between academics, practitioners, research students, policymakers about the implications and about the social, political and scientific context within which these surveys are being carried out and literacy is being conceptualised as number. And I think we share also as organisers this commitment to applying critical policy, ethnographic and sociological research perspectives to literacy assessment. And these, and also historical as well, very important and interesting, I think. And this kind of interdisciplinary and cross-community conversation is not that easy to find. And that's why today is so special and why it would be a really good plan to develop it beyond today as well, I think. Okay. Those of us organising the seminar and many of the people in this room, I think, have this kind of idea as a starting point, that literacies are not just a set of skills that can be unproblematically measured, but they're embedded in the social life and the social context within which people live, use and are being tested on their literacy. So I don't think that these are very unusual statements. The meanings and values of literacy are contingent and situated. I think this is a kind of bedrock assumption really for today. So I hope if there are people here who don't share this or have got things to say about it, there might well be, that could be part of the debate as well. And Richard Darvill, who unfortunately can't be with us, but has written very eloquently, I think, about the issues that we're going to be talking about today, has reminded us that what is and can be done in terms of literacy learning and teaching between teachers and learners is shaped not only by teachers' knowledge and beliefs, but also within a large array of managerial conditions, funding rules, credentialing, requirements, student eligibility, curriculum and so on. So literacy doesn't stand on its own, it's within these frameworks, and as I think you'll hear from some people today, those frameworks themselves are also connected very intimately with some of the new assessment regimes that are being applied across context. Okay. I wanted to say something about how, as we were developing the ideas for this conference, we had lots of other side conversations with people, and we came across other things going on that we have connected with and that this seminar will continue the conversation on. So one of these is Gemma's ESRC fellowship that has had an associated seminar series with it, which some of us have contributed to, on literacy attainment data and discourse. And Gemma's been turning up some very interesting things by taking an historical perspective on literacy attainment, the kind of data that's been collected in different eras, and how that might connect with our understandings of what we're doing today. So that's one of the strands. Another one, and Gemma's over here, another one which is also represented in the room is the Centre for Literacy in Montreal. Linda, where are you? Linda's there. We're very fortunate to have Linda Shohat here with us today. The Centre for Literacy has done some great work over the years of bringing people together, particularly in summer institutes, to talk about the international survey results. And the latest summer institute is coming up very soon after this, and Brian is going to go over to talk there, and we'll be sending some of the information and the summaries of the discussions from today to that institute in order to keep the kind of flow of conversation going. So that's another thing. The next two are a bit more generic, but there's some very interesting stuff, particularly in the European domain now, about issues of governance by data more broadly. And Soteria, I don't know, are you here yet? Soteria, it's you, great. Soteria Grech is here today, and she's been involved in some of the really interesting pan-European projects that have been going on in this area, looking at the way in which new policy spaces are being created, and particularly through the alliances of different international or transnational agencies. And this is not just an issue for literacy, this is an issue for a big range of social policy issues which are being assessed, and where there are league tables being developed in the same way, and policy spaces. So that's a third area. And then this last one, which I don't have anyone's name to particularly pin to it here, but it's really important. I work at the moment with a big and creative group of PhD students on the Technology Enhanced Learning programme at Lancaster. And they are very excited about the interface between new technologies and learning, and fascinated by the ways in which for example, you can now trace many different aspects of learning through the technologies that are being used for teaching and learning. So not just achievement, although that's one of them, but also documenting patterns of learner participation, social networking, and for research purposes, for institutional purposes, and for tutor feedback, and for monitoring. So this is a really big area that I think the discussions we're having today touch on, but it goes, much, much further away. And we've had lots of examples in the press recently here in the UK about the ways in which governments are interested in scooping up the data that is left as traces online when people learn. And given that a lot of literacy learning is now taking place online, that is a really big issue, I think, as well. So I wanted just to put that on the table and to keep that in mind as we go. Okay, we laid out 4 themes for the day, and these are the ones, and I just wanted to go very quickly through each of them to remind you of them, because these are really going to be the strands that hold together the different sessions that you're going to go to, and just to elaborate them a little bit. Okay, so the politics of literacy measurement regimes. I've already really introduced this one, talking about the globalization of literacy assessment, the ways in which policies that originate in more transnational contexts and concerns are actually coming home to national policies and also within national practice of literacy. And I guess the concerns around this would be to do with the politics of this process, closed and open politics, the degree of transparency, and the ways in which these kinds of assessment results are reported and enter into public discourse and deliberation, or don't very often. I mean, there are patchy kinds of discussions about these survey results in every country, I'm sure, that is represented here. But in terms of real understanding of what those survey results mean, in terms of interpreting them, there are some very big slippages that happen between the production of the tests and what actually happens in a national context, and particularly in terms of the discussions that go on around it. It's a very political process. The actual issue of numbers in policy discourse, what people make of them, as opposed to other kinds of data or other kinds of information about literacy, that's something that really interests me a lot. And I'll say a bit more about that in a bit. But I think, what do numbers bring to policy discourse? Why are they so important to policymakers? Those are the kinds of questions that we want to talk about under this heading. And the local responses to global policy agendas. And again, there's beginning to be quite a lot of research studies being done, particularly around the results of PISA, for example, to do with what are the local country responses to the results that come from these surveys. Okay, approaching assessment practices through ethnographic and socio-material inquiry. Now, this is a perspective, a kind of close-up look at what goes on in terms of constructing tests and circulating the results that I think all the organisers of this conference share. But I couldn't claim that everybody in the room would sign up to these approaches. I know quite a lot of people are interested in them. So I just thought I would introduce it here. The idea is, the names of the approaches, which are very central, are multi-sited ethnography, where you don't just focus on one bounded context, but you're looking at the way in which geographical contexts and social contexts are connected with one another in quite complicated ways. Institutional ethnography, which is identified with the work of Dorothy Smith in Canada, and who's tried to reconceptualize what the idea of institution might mean, and to really challenge the idea that what you've got is some kind of structural block of people or institutions doing something to everybody else, and to really look at a much more nuanced way of looking at the systemic, the global and the local, and how we're all entangled in the social relations of the everyday to create these institutional patterns. Very interesting approach, I think, which I know will surface because there are some people who are using that approach in the room. And actor network theory is the third one, which again some people may know, others may not. One of the big ideas of actor network theory is that it's not just people who have agency within these regimes of testing, but it's actually the things that are created. So, and those things can be a test item, it can be a scientific procedure, it can be an idea, it can be a set of resources that are used or are absent, perhaps, in a particular situation. So the idea is that when we accomplish big things in terms of policy, this is through a network of human and non-human artifacts, if you like, and the flows between them. So again, that's something that will come up during the day, and it's quite a challenging perspective, but one that fits really well, I think, into these kinds of testing regimes. Another thing from actor network theory that's very, very central and really determines the methodology of it. So it's the idea that this kind of theoretical approach actually entails a methodology which is ethnographic. You need to look close up in detail at the workings of testing communities and the ways that their work is dispersed through other communities. So often the way this is put is the opening up of the black boxes of technology, the way in which you can have incredible, complicated and very nuanced discussions around a test item, for example, that's included in a survey, but that discussion is not visible to people at the end of the chain, because that discussion gets resolved, the test item gets included in a test, the test becomes formalised and stabilised, and somehow the workings that went into it are not visible to many people who are then affected by it. So this idea of black boxes, I think people will refer to during the day, and the idea of making visible the backroom workings of measurement practices. So that's a very quick introduction to ANT. I've already referred to this, the politics and practices of cross-cultural literacy assessment. So in the construction of test items, many discussions go on about which items are appropriate, how they can be adapted across contexts, and the fact that we're now trying to include a much wider set of contexts for literacy assessment makes this process ever more challenging and ever more important to open up and look at, and to maybe share some of the insights about what it means to translate culture and language in assessment practices like this. Because I think there's, potentially a lot of new insights that could be brought from that. And then the fourth one we've called enumerative, ideological and semiotic practices. That sounds big. But this is really moving towards my own interests, which are about the different ways in which literacy might be represented and the kinds of properties of different semiotic resources. Typically, when we talk about semiotics, we're talking about language, discourse. We're also talking about visual images. I think it's really important to include number as a semiotic resource as well. And here we've got something that is a bit material. So, material things can also have semiotics attached to them. Their meaning. We use them to make meaning. So it's looking across that whole range of different ways in which we represent and imagine literacy. That would be the terminology I would use. And I just want, in the last few minutes that I've got, to talk a little bit about my own interest in this. So I've just completed a book called Literacy and the Politics of Representation, and the argument behind that book, I suppose, is that there are many different ways in which we could imagine what literacy is. And I think policy uses imagination all the time in the actual process and then in the way of dispersing and kind of persuading different actors in the field to take on board the imaginings of those policy processes. And I would say that they're really crucial. These ways that we imagine things actually have a connection to social action. That's really important. So people who do discourse analysis make that argument all the time, that discourse is not just a kind of esoteric interest of linguists or social semioticians, but actually it has real effects on social life. And I think for me that's a real foundational understanding of what we're going to be talking about today. So, imagining literacy, that's what we're about, really, when we're designing assessments, we're designing policy, we are working in classrooms with teachers and with learners. So how does literacy function in individual lives, but also in collective life? What do we think about that? How do we imagine what literacy is? And what uses does it have for the state and for other institutions as well? And you can if you're interested in this, you can pick up lots of different ways in which literacy has been imagined in contrasting ways over the years. As I was writing the book, I got very interested in the work of Hannah More, who actually comes from my own hometown of Bristol and was living at the end of the 18th century. And she opened many charity schools, and she was a big actor on the social stage in England at that time. And she had a very clear moral view about what literacy was about. We labour strenuously to attach our people to the state as well as to the church. Even when the poor are educated, they must be provided with safe materials. So the idea of safe literacy. And this safe literacy was actually reading. It wasn't writing. And that's a kind of thing that has a distinction that has, I think, had long-term effects through our education system. Not just Hannah, but many other people shared those views at the time. And I have to say that she was very strategic and clever. This kind of presents her, I think, in a more black and white way than she actually worked on the ground, but she was very good advocacy. She knew where she could prize money for literacy from, and she tailored her arguments in that way. So anyway, I could say more about that if anybody's interested. Okay, here's another one. There's a lovely set of these posters that are freely available online. This is from Russia, Soviet Union, and again, this idea of the struggle with the monster of literacy, very potent kind of way of imagining what literacy or illiteracy is, that you can see echoes of in many other literacy campaigns. And then finally, this is quite an old one now, but this is a UNESCO poster. Again, a really interesting collection of these posters over the years that you can have a look at and see the different ways in which, creative ways in which people are trying to imagine what literacy is in order to promote and advocate for it. Okay, I've picked up from Charles Taylor, who's a Canadian philosopher, social philosopher, this idea of the social imaginary. So this is developing the idea of imagining what literacy is. And he's saying actually there's a bigger imagining going on, which is to do with the way that we as people fit together, how we imagine our social existence, how we fit together with others, how things go between us and our fellows, and the expectations that are normally met. The social imaginary is that common understanding that makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy. And I think that literacy is deeply implicated in this kind of social imaginary, and so is number, the way that we use and imagine what numbers are. So if you bring those together, you've got an important kind of framework, I think, for thinking about literacy as number today. The last kind of bit that I want to add into this is this work that I came across again when I was writing my book that I was very, very impressed with. Most people involved in discourse analysis or semiotic analysis don't take into account number. But OHalloran, who's based in Singapore and has a whole media lab where she's developing multimodal ways of analysing data apart from anything else, which is great. But she's written a lot about mathematical discourse and looked into the history of how it has developed. And her argument, which I think is very interesting for us again today, is that that mathematical symbolism evolved from language to develop new systems of meaning, which language couldn't support alone. Okay, so she, and people here might really disagree with this, but she has a kind of essentialist view of numbers, that there's something in the property of numbers and mathematical reasoning that means we can do things, we can shape our conversations and our understandings in a way that we can't do with language alone. And she says what that thing is the ability to manipulate continuous patterns of relations between entities in time and space, okay? And she says language isn't very good about that. Language is good at making categories, but it's not so good at supporting that precision in developing continuous patterns of relations. And I feel quite convinced by that, but I'm happy to be, have discussions about it. And the other key point from OHalloran is that she says it's not just numbers alone that do this powerfully, but it's the combination of numbers with visualization and with words that gives us the best purchase, the most powerful purchase on meaning. And if you look at these, you don't need to know, you don't have to look at the data, just look at these as pictures, okay? There are some fantastic visualizations now within all the international reports that are coming out. And there must be, I don't know, perhaps some people here do, a whole army of people whose job it is to design this information in the most attractive and most accessible way. Fantastic work that they're doing. And the block graph, here's two versions of it. And I'm not quite sure what you would call this. Probably there is a technical name for it, but it's wonderful. And it does actually help you trace quite complicated and overlapping relationships in one place. And that's one of the things I think about mathematical visualization, that it enables a lot of dense information to be presented and appreciated in a small place. And for those of us who tend to jump across those diagrams because we can't cope with them, we only deal with words, we're missing a lot here. Okay, and I think in terms of the public discourse and discussion, that's a very important point. Okay, and I'll just whip fairly quickly through this because I don't think any of this will be a surprise, but in terms of policy discourse, this semiotics of numbers enters very frequently, and I've done work on the English Skills for Life adult literacy campaign, and I've looked at a lot of the policy texts that were produced as part of that, and I can see masses of ways in which numbers enter in. So the international and national test scores that I've been talking about so far are just one bit of that, the kind of tip of the iceberg, if you like. We use cost-benefit analyses a lot to say, you know, if you are only a level 1 literacy learner, then you're likely to lose out in this amount of ways in your earnings over your lifetime. And the nation is likely to lose out, you know, in these kind of millions or billions of pounds. So actually, the cost-benefit analyses are really important for justifying the policy for us. Then once we get people into programmes, we're doing lots of counting of participation rates, the numbers of courses that we put on, the qualifications people are getting, the targets that they reach, that individual providers reach or don't reach. There are funding formulae and fees, calculating the value of a course to individuals and to an institution. And what's really interesting too is that a lot of these numbers implicate time. They are time bounded or times included in it. You know, it's not just what someone achieves in terms of literacy, but what they achieve within a particular number of learning sessions or a particular programme. And so often policy will put time boundaries around the numbers that it's collecting. Really interesting. Again, I haven't kind of thought that through in any more depth than that, but I think it's an important thing to talk about. Representation through number creates borders and classifications, categories of things that we can treat as variables, and very crucially levels of ordering. So numbers, these special powers of numbers, I would say, is all about this kind of ranking, ordering and categorising, which is based on a fantastic number of quite subjective judgments that, as I said before, once the test goes into the international domain, for example, tends to get black box. Those decisions that are made to set these kinds of boundaries and classifications become closed up. And what is enabled particularly through this kind of representation is that generalisations can be made out of context, out of the context of an individual person's life. That's the power of it. That's, you know, that's the strength and the benefit of it. And as I said before, precise relationships can be made to measure between literacy and other variables. So I'm making a strong pitch here that is very essentialist, and it's about number. It's not to do with, okay, numbers would be fine as long as we use them properly. There is that issue as well. How do we use them? How do we appreciate them? How are we critical or not critical of them? But I think there is stuff about the way in which numbers operate that it's important for us to take on board as well. And you can argue with me about that. I'm very happy for that to happen. So, finally, numbers help organise our understanding of literacy and imagine it through processes of commodification. That is, it makes it into a quantifiable thing that can be exchanged in a marketplace and quantifiably compared with other things. It normalises through creating categories which include or exclude particular groups of people, particular kinds of knowledge. It enables comparison across context, time and place in very precise ways, and it also is really useful for auditing and surveillance of practice because you can collect precise data. So, my argument is that the powerful form of semiosis that was invented by Descartes and on which Newton built his experimental science was, in the way that it's used to simplify and generalise, designed to banish human context, experience and sensuality from truth. And this is the argument, the core argument that OHalloran makes. And as a result, numbers offer much more in terms of their power, but at the price of admitting substantially less, the things that get excluded from mathematical representations and generalizations. Okay, how am I doing for time? I'm about right. So, I think there's going to be some interviews going on today, and which are, again, are going to be taken forward from this seminar. And we concocted some questions to be considered, and here they are. So I'm inviting everybody really in the room to consider these as we go through today. What do you think is lost and gained by treating literacy as number? What might good literacy assessment of the future look like? So it's easy to look at the drawbacks or the challenges of the assessments that we have, but what would we want? What would assessment projects gain from working with sociological or anthropological researchers? So people who are looking from a critical policy perspective and people who are looking close up into the inner workings of literacy assessment. What value would that bring? And how can assessment projects become more open, transparent, democratic, so that the ways that they work and the purposes that they have are shared in a more open and democratic way? What goes into the black boxes of literacy assessment? What is it that gets closed down that we can't see? And I would say, are the black boxes actually black boxes for some people but not for others? So are there kind of grey boxes that are open to some people if you've got enough technical know-how or access to documents, but not to other people? And finally, how can we continue the dialogue that we started today? As I've said, we have got some plans to send information from today on to other events that are happening. We also plan to produce an edited book from the presentations today, which will be put into a proposal very, very soon. I think it's going to be a fantastic collection. So we've got some ideas, but we'd welcome other ones as well. And I think at that point I'm going to finish, and maybe we've got a few minutes where people could react or add some questions or make some comments that would take us into the coffee break and then on to the next session. Thank you.